For 35 years, she couldn't enter the barn. Her husband forbade it. But after the funeral, she broke her promise. What she saw inside brought her to her knees. For 3.5 decades, Lynette Brooks had stared at that weathered red barn from her kitchen window, wondering what secrets lay behind its heavy wooden doors. Her husband Jonathan had made one thing crystal clear from the day they married: she was never, under any circumstances, to enter that barn. But when death finally claimed him, she found the key, and what she discovered inside would shatter everything she thought she knew about their marriage. The story begins in 1987, in the rolling farmlands of Nebraska, where Jonathan Brooks first brought his new bride Lynette to their modest 2-story farmhouse. The property was perfect: 40 acres of fertile land, a cozy home with a wraparound porch, and that distinctive red barn that sat about 200 yards from the house, its paint still fresh and vibrant against the endless prairie sky. Lynette still remembered that first day vividly. She was 23, fresh out of college with dreams of teaching elementary school and raising a house full of children. Jonathan, at 26, was everything she'd ever wanted in a husband: tall and gentle, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and kind eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. He'd inherited the farm from his grandfather and had plans to modernize it, to build something that would last for generations. As they walked the property that first afternoon, Lynette had pointed excitedly toward the barn. "Oh, Jonathan, it's perfect. We could keep horses in there, maybe some chickens. And when the children come, they'll love having animals to care for." But Jonathan's expression had shifted, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He'd stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gently gripping her shoulders. "Lynette, honey, I need you to promise me something. That barn, it's off limits. I use it for my woodworking and other projects. It's not safe for anyone else to be in there. Tools everywhere, chemicals, you understand." Lynette had laughed, thinking he was being overly protective. "Jonathan, I grew up on a farm. I know how to be careful around Dash. Promise me." His voice had carried a weight she'd never heard before, almost desperate. "Promise me you'll never go in there. Not while I'm away, not when I'm working, never. Can you do that for me?" The intensity in his voice had caught her off guard, but she'd nodded, assuming it was just newlywed protectiveness. "Of course, if it's that important to you." What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments below. Their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her 70s who'd lived on the adjacent property for 50 years, had pulled Lynette aside during their housewarming party a few weeks later. "Dear, I've known Jonathan since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. That boy's got the gentlest heart in 3 counties, but he's been different since his parents died in that car accident when he was 19. Lost and searching for something, if you ask me." "Different how?" Lynette had asked, glancing toward her husband who was chatting with the local pastor near the fence line. "Well, he started spending all his time in that barn after the funeral. His grandfather used to worry about him, said he'd go in there for hours and hours, sometimes all night, hammering and sawing, making all kinds of noise. But when old Mr. Brooks tried to see what the boy was building, Jonathan would get upset, almost panicked. Eventually, his grandfather just learned to leave him be." Mrs. Henderson had studied Lynette's face carefully. "I'm not one to spread gossip, mind you, but I've seen that barn lit up at all hours over the years. Even now, as a grown man with a wife, he's out there most evenings. Makes a person wonder what's so important that it keeps a man from his supper table." As the months turned into years, Lynette learned to work around the mystery of the barn. Jonathan would disappear after dinner, claiming he needed to work on projects or organize his tools. She'd hear the distant sound of hammering, the whir of power tools, sometimes what sounded like furniture being moved around. But whenever she'd casually suggest bringing him coffee or helping with whatever he was working on, that same desperate look would cross his face. "Honey, you know the rule. It's my space, okay? Every man needs a place where he can think and work without distractions. You understand, don't you?" And Lynette did understand, or at least she tried to. Her own father had been the same way about his workshop in the basement. But as the years passed and their attempts to start a family continued to fail, she began to wonder if Jonathan's secrecy was connected to their struggles. By 1995, 8 years into their marriage, The strain was beginning to show. Lynette had endured 3 miscarriages, each one more devastating than the last. The doctors had run every test imaginable, but everything came back normal. Sometimes, Dr. Martinez had explained gently, these things just happen. There's no medical reason why you can't carry a baby to term. We just need to keep trying and stay hopeful. But hope was becoming harder to maintain. Lynette found herself staring at that barn more and more frequently, wondering if the answers to their problems somehow lay behind those locked doors. Jonathan's behavior had become increasingly protective, almost possessive of his space. He'd installed a heavy padlock and warned the mailman, the utility workers, even their closest friends that the barn was strictly off-limits. One particularly difficult evening, after receiving news that their 4th pregnancy had ended in miscarriage, Lynette had finally confronted him directly. They were sitting on their front porch, the barn clearly visible in the fading twilight, its windows dark and mysterious. "Jonathan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she spoke. "Is there something in that barn that's affecting our ability to have children? Chemicals, pesticides, something toxic that dash?" "No." His response was immediate and firm. "Lynette, there's nothing dangerous in there. Nothing that would hurt you or a baby." "Then what is it? What could possibly be so secret that your own wife can't see it? We've been married 8 years, Jonathan. 8 years, and I don't even know what my husband does in his spare time." Jonathan had stood up abruptly, pacing to the porch railing. His knuckles were white as he gripped the wood. Some things are too personal to share, even with the person you love most in the world. More personal than losing 4 babies. The words had come out harsher than she'd intended, but the pain was too raw to contain. More personal than watching your wife fall apart every time we get our hopes up. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan's shoulders had sagged, and for a moment, Lynette thought he might finally tell her the truth. Instead, he turned around with tears in his eyes and said the words that would haunt her for the next 2 decades. "If you truly love me, you'll never ask me about that barn again. And you'll never, ever try to go inside." Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below. Their marriage had survived, but something fundamental had shifted that night. Lynette threw herself into her teaching career, becoming the kind of elementary school teacher that children remembered for the rest of their lives. She started volunteering at the local women's shelter, mentoring teenage mothers, pouring all her maternal instincts into caring for other people's children. Jonathan, meanwhile, seemed to spend even more time in the barn. Some nights, Lynette would wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. to find his side of the bed empty, and she'd see the soft glow of light emanating from the barn windows. She'd learned to pack his lunch in the morning and leave it on the kitchen counter, knowing he'd grab it on his way out to work the fields, but she no longer knew what projects consumed his evenings. Their neighbor Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, had made several attempts over the years to satisfy her own curiosity about the barn. "That man orders more lumber than a construction company," she'd tell Lynette during their weekly coffee visits. "I see the delivery trucks at least twice a month. And the paint, Lord have mercy, the paint. Every color you can imagine. What on earth is he building in there?" But Lynette had learned to change the subject, to deflect questions about Jonathan's mysterious hobby. She developed a repertoire of vague responses: "Oh, you know men and their projects," or "He's always been handy with his hands," or "I think it helps him relax after working the farm all day." The truth was, she'd stopped asking questions because she was terrified of the answers. What if Jonathan was hiding an addiction? What if he was building something illegal? What if, the thought that scared her most of all, what if he was preparing to leave her? By 2010, their 23rd wedding anniversary had come and gone with the usual quiet dinner and exchange of modest gifts. They'd settled into a comfortable but distant routine. Lynette had her teaching, her volunteering, her carefully tended vegetable garden. Jonathan had his farming, his morning coffee ritual, and his mysterious evenings in the barn. They still loved each other. That much was clear in the way he'd bring her wildflowers from the far pasture, or how she'd leave little notes in his lunchbox. But there was an elephant in the room that had grown so large they'd simply learned to navigate around it. The beginning of the end came in March 2022, 35 years after Lynette had first seen that barn. Jonathan had been complaining of fatigue for months, dismissing her concerns with his usual stubbornness. "It's just spring planting season, honey. I'm not as young as I used to be." But when he collapsed while feeding the cattle one morning, there was no more denying that something was seriously wrong. Dr. Patel at the regional medical center had delivered the diagnosis with a kind of professional gentleness that somehow made the words even more devastating: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8 if they were lucky. Lynette still remembered every detail of that moment. The sterile smell of the hospital room, the way the afternoon sun slanted through the Venetian blinds, creating prison bar shadows on the white linoleum floor. Jonathan's hand in hers, suddenly feeling so fragile, the calluses she'd known for decades now somehow precious because they wouldn't be there much longer. "I'm not afraid of dying," Jonathan had whispered to her that first night home from the hospital. They were lying in bed, and she could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking each passing minute with relentless precision. "But I'm terrified of leaving you alone." "You're not leaving me anywhere," Lynette had replied fiercely. "We're going to fight this. We're going to get you the best treatment money can buy. We're going to dash." "Lynette." His voice was so gentle, so final. "We both know how this ends. The only question is how we spend whatever time we have left." That's when she'd made her own confession, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Jonathan, I don't care anymore what's in that barn. I don't care if you're hiding moonshine or marijuana or another woman's love letters. I just want to spend every minute we have left actually knowing my husband. Really knowing you." Jonathan had been quiet for so long that she thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "It's not what you think it is, Linny. It's never been what you think it is. But I can't. Even now, especially now, I can't show you. Please don't ask me to. Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your story." The next 6 months were a blur of doctor appointments, chemotherapy sessions, and sleepless nights. Jonathan's body grew weaker, but his spirit remained stubbornly strong. He insisted on continuing his evening visits to the barn, even when he could barely walk the distance without stopping to rest. "It's important," he'd tell her when she begged him to conserve his strength. "I have to finish something. I have to make sure everything is ready." "Ready for what?" she'd asked, but he'd just smile that sad, mysterious smile and change the subject. Dr. Patel had been amazed by Jonathan's determination. "I've never seen anything like it," he confided to Lynette during one of their private conversations. "Patients at this stage usually want to stay close to home, close to comfort. But your husband seems driven by something. What could be so important in that old barn?" Lynette had laughed bitterly. "Doctor, I've been married to that man for 35 years, and I couldn't answer that question if my life depended on it." Mrs. Henderson, now 93 and using a walker but still mentally sharp, had become a daily visitor during Jonathan's final months. She'd sit with him on the front porch, sharing memories of his childhood, his parents, his grandfather. During one of these visits, she'd pulled Lynette aside with tears in her eyes. "That boy is preparing for something, Lynette. I can see it in his face, the same look he had after his parents died. He's trying to make peace with something, trying to set something right. I wish I knew what it was, for both your sakes." The night before Jonathan died, he'd insisted on one final trip to the barn. Lynette had watched from the kitchen window as he'd made his slow, painful way across the yard, pausing every few steps to catch his breath. He'd stayed out there for nearly 3 hours, and when he came back, his face was streaked with tears. "It's finished," he'd whispered as she helped him into bed. "Everything I ever wanted to say, everything I ever wanted to do, it's all there. And someday when you're ready, you'll understand." He'd pressed something into her hand, a small warm key. "Not yet," he'd said urgently. "Promise me, not while I'm still here. Wait until after. And when you do go in there, remember that everything I did because I loved you more than life itself." Those were among the last coherent words he spoke. Jonathan Brooks died 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning in September, with Lynette holding his hand and sunlight streaming through their bedroom window. The funeral had been everything Jonathan would have wanted, simple, dignified, filled with the people who'd known and loved him. The entire community had turned out. Students from Lynette's classes over the years, now grown with children of their own. Farmers from neighboring properties who'd relied on Jonathan's help during difficult seasons. Even Mrs. Henderson, despite her age and frailty, had insisted on attending. Pastor Williams had spoken beautifully about Jonathan's quiet strength, his dedication to his community, his unwavering love for his wife. But as Lynette sat in that first pew, surrounded by flowers and sympathy cards, all she could think about was the key in her pocket and the promise she'd made. The days following the funeral passed in a haze of casseroles from neighbors, phone calls from relatives, and the overwhelming silence of an empty house. Lynette found herself unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything except that barn and the mystery that had defined her marriage. Mrs. Henderson had moved in temporarily, sleeping in the guest room and making sure Lynette ate at least one meal a day. "Grief makes people do strange things," she'd said gently on the fourth night after the funeral. "But whatever you're thinking about doing, honey, make sure you're ready for the consequences." "What do you mean?" Lynette had asked, though she knew exactly what the older woman was referring to. "That key he gave you. I saw him press it into your hand that last night. Whatever's in that barn, it meant everything to him. Make sure you're prepared to learn something that might change how you remember him." But Lynette was beyond preparation. The not knowing had become unbearable. For 35 years, she'd respected her husband's wishes, had honored his need for privacy. But he was gone now, and she was alone with questions that had consumed half her lifetime. On the 7th night after the funeral, she'd finally worked up the courage. The autumn air was crisp, and the moon was full, casting long shadows across the farmyard. Lynette had put on her warmest coat and grabbed a flashlight, though she could have walked to that barn blindfolded after all these years. The padlock was exactly where it had always been, heavy and imposing. But the key fit perfectly, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo across the empty fields. For a moment, she'd hesitated, her hand on the cold metal handle. Once she opened this door, there would be no going back. Whatever lay inside would become part of her reality forever. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments below. The door opened with a creak of hinges that probably hadn't moved in months. Lynette stepped inside and flicked on her flashlight, then immediately gasped and nearly dropped it. This wasn't what she'd expected at all. The barn wasn't filled with farming equipment or woodworking tools or any of the things she'd imagined over the decades. Instead, she found herself standing in what could only be described as a nursery. Not just any nursery, but the most beautiful, carefully crafted children's room she'd ever seen. The walls were painted in soft pastels, yellow and green and the palest pink. There were hand-painted murals of farm animals and fairy tale characters, each one executed with an artist's attention to detail. Lynette's flashlight beam swept across the space in disbelief. Against the far wall stood a hand-carved wooden crib, painted white with delicate pink and blue trim. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every spindle perfectly turned, every joint seamlessly fitted. Beside it was a matching changing table, its surface worn smooth as if from years of use, though she knew that was impossible. There was a rocking chair in the corner, the same style her grandmother had owned, with a soft quilt draped over its arm. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with children's books, some she recognized from her classroom, others that looked handmade with careful illustrations and hand-lettered text. But it was the small details that made her knees weak. A mobile hung over the crib, featuring tiny wooden farm animals that she now realized Jonathan must have carved himself. There were stuffed animals arranged carefully on a low shelf, each one clean and new as if waiting for small hands to claim them. On the changing table sat a neat stack of cloth diapers, and in a basket beside the chair were tiny knitted booties in every color imaginable. "My God," Lynette whispered, her voice echoing in the sacred space. "Jonathan, what is this place?" That's when she noticed the journal on the small table beside the rocking chair. It was leather-bound and worn, clearly used frequently over many years. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to read by flashlight. September 15th, 1987. Today I started building a crib for our first baby. I know Lynette doesn't know yet. We just got married last month, but I can feel it in my bones. We're going to have children, lots of them, and they're going to need a special place where their daddy can rock them to sleep and read them stories. I picked out a name today. If it's a girl, Sarah May, after my grandmother. If it's a boy, Michael Jonathan. I can't wait to meet them. Lynette sank into the rocking chair, the journal clutched to her chest. There were hundreds of entries, spanning 35 years. She read about Jonathan's excitement during each of her pregnancies, his devastation after each miscarriage. But more than that, she read about the children who had lived fully in his imagination, the children they'd never had. December 3, 1989. Today Sarah would have been 2 years old. I finished painting her name above the crib. I know Lynette thinks I don't grieve the babies we've lost, but I do. I grieve them here, where I can imagine what they would have been like. Sarah would have had her mother's laugh and her stubborn streak. She would have loved the horses and probably tried to bring every stray cat on the farm into the house. Page after page revealed the depth of Jonathan's secret fatherhood. He'd imagined birthday parties and first days of school, lost teeth and scraped knees, Christmas mornings and bedtime stories. He'd written letters to children who existed only in his heart, had planned their futures and mourned their absence in the privacy of this hidden nursery. As Lynette continued reading, she discovered that Jonathan's ritual had evolved over the years. What had started as a coping mechanism had become something deeper, a way of processing his grief while protecting her from the full weight of his own pain. March 21, 1995. After the fourth miscarriage, I thought about telling Lynette about this place. But how can I explain that I've been raising our children in my imagination? How can I tell her that I know exactly what Michael's laugh would sound like, or that Sarah would have inherited her grandmother's talent for baking? She's hurting enough. This is my burden to carry. The entries revealed a man who had been trying to shield his wife from the depth of his own grief, who had created this space not out of delusion but out of love. Jonathan had understood that their infertility was devastating for both of them, but he'd also recognized that they grieved differently. Where Lynette needed to talk and process and seek medical answers, Jonathan needed to create and imagine and build something tangible. June 10, 2001. I added a growth chart to the wall today. In my heart, Sarah is 14 now, tall for her age and probably embarrassed by her old dad. Michael is 12 and obsessed with baseball. I found myself picking out a glove for him at the store yesterday before I remembered. Sometimes the line between imagination and reality gets blurry in here. But maybe that's okay. Maybe that's the point. Lynette discovered that Jonathan had developed elaborate backstories for each of the children they'd lost. He'd given them personalities, interests, hopes, and dreams. He'd celebrated their imaginary birthdays, worried about their fictional problems, and planned for their non-existent futures. The nursery wasn't just a room, it was a shrine to parental love that had nowhere else to go. Near the back of the journal, she found blueprints and sketches. Jonathan had planned expansions to the barn, separate rooms for when the children got older, a play area, even a small classroom where Lynette could help with homework. He'd envisioned family movie nights, holiday celebrations, graduation parties. All of it meticulously planned, lovingly detailed, heartbreakingly impossible. August 17, 2020. The doctor says I might not have much time left. I need to decide what to do about this place. Part of me wants to burn it all down, to spare Lynette the pain of discovering how deep my fantasy went. But another part of me thinks she deserves to know that even though we never had children, we were still parents. We still loved them. They were still real to us, even if they were only real in here. The final entries were clearly written during Jonathan's illness, his handwriting growing shakier but his words more urgent. September 8, 2022. I gave Lynette the key tonight. I don't know if she'll ever use it, but at least now she has the choice. I hope that when she finds this place, she'll understand that it wasn't about keeping secrets from her. It was about keeping the dream alive, even when reality was too painful to bear. Every toy I bought, every story I wrote, every lullaby I hummed in here, it was all for the children we loved but never got to hold. But the final page of the journal contained something that took Lynette's breath away. My dearest Lynette, if you're reading this, then you've finally come into our children's room. I know this might seem crazy or even cruel, but I need you to know that this place was never about grief. It was about hope. Every day for 35 years, I came in here and imagined what our family could have been. I raised our children in my heart, and they were beautiful and perfect and loved beyond measure. I know we both blamed ourselves for not being able to have babies. But in here, we did have them. In here, we were the parents we always dreamed of being. Sarah has your eyes and your kind heart. Michael has my stubbornness, but your wisdom. Little Emma, she came to me in a dream last year, has your laugh and my love of terrible jokes. I kept this from you not because I was ashamed, but because I was afraid you'd think I was living in a fantasy world instead of facing reality with you. But the truth is, this place kept me sane. It kept our love for our unborn children alive. It let me be a father even when biology said I couldn't be. There's a photo album on the bookshelf, our family portraits that exist only in my imagination. There are birthday cards I wrote for children who never had birthdays. There are Christmas lists and report cards and all the ephemera of family life that we never got to experience. But most importantly, there's a letter I wrote for you. It's in the music box on the dresser, the one that plays Brahms' Lullaby. In that letter, I've tried to explain how much I love you, how sorry I am for all the secrets, and what I hope you'll do with this space now that I'm gone. You were never just my wife, Lynette. In here, you were always the mother of our children. And they love you as much as I do. Your devoted husband and the father of our imaginary family, Jonathan. Lynette's hands shook as she made her way to the music box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the letter Jonathan had promised. But first, she allowed herself to really look around the room with new eyes. The photo album was exactly where he'd said it would be. With tears streaming down her face, she opened it to find dozens of pictures, not real photographs, but detailed drawings of family moments that had never happened. Jonathan had drawn himself teaching a young boy to throw a baseball. He'd sketched Lynette reading bedtime stories to two little girls. There were family picnics and Christmas mornings, first days of school and high school graduations. Each drawing was labeled with dates and details. Sarah's first day of kindergarten, September 1992. She was nervous but excited. Mama packed her favorite peanut butter sandwich. Michael's Little League Championship, June 1998. He hit the game-winning double and looked for Daddy in the stands. The birthday cards were even more devastating. Handmade cards for children who would never age, filled with Father's love and hopes and dreams. To Sarah on your sweet 16, you're growing into such a beautiful young woman. I can't wait to embarrass you by crying at your prom send-off. Love, Dad. This story will restore your faith in the power of love. Finally, Lynette opened Jonathan's final letter. My darling Lynette. By now you've seen what I've been building all these years. I know it must seem overwhelming, maybe even disturbing. But please understand that this room was never about escaping reality. It was about creating space for a love that had nowhere else to go. We never got to be parents in the way we planned, but we were parents nonetheless. Every time you comforted a crying student, you were being a mother. Every time I fixed a broken toy or taught a neighborhood kid to use tools, I was being a father. Our capacity for parental love didn't disappear just because we couldn't have biological children. This room is my gift to you, not the sadness of it, but the love of it. I want you to see that our marriage wasn't defined by what we lacked, but by how much we had to give. We loved children who existed only in our hearts, and that love was real and beautiful and worth celebrating. I know you've always wanted to adopt, and I know I was too scared, too set in my ways to take that leap. But now I'm asking you to consider it. Not because you need to fill this room with real children, though you could, but because you have so much love to give, and somewhere out there are children who need exactly the kind of mother you would be. If you decide to move forward with adoption, use the money for my life insurance. Transform this barn if you want to, or keep it exactly as it is, a reminder that love doesn't require biology, that family is built with intention and care, not just genetics. But whatever you do, don't let my secret make you think our marriage was built on lies. It was built on love, love for each other, love for the children we dreamed of, and love for the family we could still become if you're brave enough to try. I'll be watching from wherever I am, proud of the mother you've always been and excited to see the mother you might still become. All my love, forever and always, Jonathan. P.S. Check the storage chest under the window. I've been collecting things for our future children, not the imaginary ones, but the real ones who might still come into our lives if you're willing to open your heart one more time." Lynette made her way to the storage chest with trembling legs. Inside, she found practical items, modern baby clothes in various sizes, still with tags attached. Current parenting books. Information packets from adoption agencies, some dating back years. Applications that Jonathan had never filled out, but had saved just in case. And at the very bottom, a small envelope with her name on it in Jonathan's handwriting. Inside was a cashier's check made out to the Nebraska Children's Home, dated just 2 weeks before his death, for the entire amount of his life insurance policy. And that's how love finds a way, even in the face of impossible loss. 6 months later, Lynette Brooks stood in that same barn, but now it buzzed with different energy. The hand-carved crib had been moved to make room for 2 twin beds, freshly made with colorful quilts. The walls still bore Jonathan's beautiful murals, but now they were complemented by artwork created by small hands, finger paintings and crayon drawings that spoke of real children living real lives. 8-year-old Maria and 6-year-old Carlos had come to live with Lynette 3 months earlier, siblings who had been waiting in foster care for a family willing to take them both. Maria was exactly the serious, thoughtful child that Jonathan had imagined Sarah might have been. Carlos had Michael's mischievous grin and boundless energy. "Miss Lynette," Maria had asked on their first night, "why did you want to adopt us? We're not babies, and most people want babies." Lynette had tucked the little girl into the bed that had once been purely imaginary and smiled. "Because I've been waiting my whole life to be your mom. I just didn't know your names yet." Mrs. Henderson, now 94 and more fragile but still determined to be part of this new chapter, had moved into the main house's guest room permanently. She'd become the children's surrogate great-grandmother, teaching them card games and sharing stories about their new hometown's history. "Jonathan would be so proud," she'd whispered to Lynette one evening as they watched Maria help Carlos with his homework at the kitchen table. "He spent 35 years preparing to be a father, and now his children are finally here." The adoption had not been easy. There were home studies and interviews, background checks and waiting periods. But the social worker assigned to their case, a young woman named Jennifer, had been moved by Lynette's story and her obvious devotion to the children she was hoping to adopt. "I've never seen anything like this," Jennifer had said during one of her visits, gesturing toward the barn-turned bedroom. "Most people adopt first and then prepare a space for their children. You've been preparing for 35 years. The children had been initially overwhelmed by the farm, by the space and the quiet and the endless sky. Both had come from difficult backgrounds. Their birth parents had struggled with addiction, and they'd been in and out of foster care since they were toddlers. But under Lynette's patient care, they'd begun to bloom. Carlos had discovered a love of animals and had appointed himself the farm's animal caretaker, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs each morning before school. Maria had inherited Jonathan's love of building things and could often be found in the workshop, the part of the barn that had actually been used for tools, carefully learning to use child-safe equipment under Lynette's supervision. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation was in Lynette herself. The grief and questioning that had defined so much of her adult life had gradually been replaced by purpose and joy. She'd taken early retirement from teaching to focus on homeschooling her new children, helping them catch up academically while also healing from their early trauma. The weekly therapy sessions that the adoption agency required had been good for all of them. Dr. Sarah Chun, a family therapist specializing in adoption, had helped them navigate the complex emotions of becoming a family. "Maria and Carlos have experienced significant loss," Dr. Chun had explained to Lynette. "But so have you. In a way, you're all grieving the families you lost while celebrating the family you're building together. That's a lot of emotions to hold at the same time." It was Dr. Chun who had suggested creating a memory book about Jonathan, helping the children understand the man who had loved them before he'd ever met them. "He drew pictures of children who looked just like us," Maria had marveled, flipping through Jonathan's photo album. "How did he know what we would look like?" "I think," Lynette had said carefully, "that love has a way of recognizing love, even across time." The memory book had become a family project. Carlos contributed by dictating stories about what he imagined Jonathan would have taught him about farming. Maria wrote letters to the grandfather she'd never met, thanking him for building the beautiful room where she now slept every night. And Lynette filled in the gaps with stories about Jonathan's kindness, his patience, his unwavering belief that their family would eventually be complete. 1 year after moving to the farm, the children had asked if they could add to Jonathan's tradition. Together, they'd painted a new mural on the barn wall, a family portrait that included all of them, even Jonathan, watching over them like a guardian angel. Carlos had insisted on adding several farm animals to the picture, while Maria had carefully painted in the details of everyone's faces. "Now Papa Jonathan is part of our family forever," Carlos had declared, using the name they'd chosen for the man they'd never met but had come to love through stories. The local community had embraced the new family wholeheartedly. Lynette's former teaching colleagues had organized welcome parties and offered babysitting services. The farmers in the area had taken Carlos under their collective wing, teaching him about crops and livestock with the same patience they might have shown their own grandchildren. Pastor Williams had performed a special blessing ceremony for the family, not quite an adoption celebration but something more meaningful, a recognition that love creates family in ways that biology never could. "Jonathan Brooks spent 35 years preparing to be a father," he'd said during the ceremony. "His children have finally come home." Little did anyone know, the most beautiful surprise was yet to come. On the second anniversary of Jonathan's death, Lynette discovered something that brought the entire story full circle. She'd been going through his old papers, preparing to file his final tax return, when she'd found a folder she'd never seen before. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed to various adoption agencies, dating back more than 20 years. The letters revealed that Jonathan had been quietly inquiring about adoption for years, researching the process, even attending informational meetings without telling Lynette. But every time he'd gotten close to moving forward, he'd stopped, convinced that he needed to be stronger, more prepared, more worthy of being a father. "Dear Lincoln County Adoption Services," one letter from 1998 read, "My wife and I have been trying to start a family for 11 years. We have a lot of love to give and a stable home to offer. But I worry that I wouldn't know how to be a good father, having lost my own parents so young. Could you please send information about your parent training programs?" Another letter from 2005, "I've been building a nursery for over 18 years now, preparing for children who might never come. My wife doesn't know about it. I was afraid she'd think I was being foolish. But maybe being foolish with hope is better than being practical with despair. Would you consider a couple in their 40s for adoption?" The most heartbreaking letter was dated just 5 years before his diagnosis. "I keep thinking I'm running out of time to be the father I've always dreamed of being. I have everything ready, a room, college funds I've been building for decades, so much love I don't know where to put it all. But I'm scared that if we adopt and I don't live long enough to see the children grown, I'll have failed them the way I feel like I failed my wife by not giving her biological children." Reading these letters, Lynette finally understood the full depth of Jonathan's internal struggle. He hadn't been keeping the barn a secret to hurt her. He'd been protecting his own vulnerable hope while simultaneously preparing for a future he was too afraid to pursue. Can you believe what happened next? This will give you chills. The revelation prompted Lynette to make a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. She contacted every adoption agency Jonathan had written to and shared his story. Within months, she'd become an advocate for older adults seeking to adopt, speaking at conferences and writing articles about how grief and hope could coexist. "My husband spent 35 years being a father in his heart," she would tell audiences. "When people say they're too old to adopt, or they've waited too long, or their dreams have passed them by, I tell them about Jonathan's barn. I tell them that love doesn't have an expiration date, and family doesn't have age limits." Maria and Carlos, now 10 and 8, had become part of her advocacy work. They would speak to prospective adoptive parents about what it was like to finally find a permanent family, how love could heal wounds they didn't even know they had. "Miss Lynette didn't just adopt us," Maria had said during one presentation. "She'd been waiting for us our whole lives. And Papa Jonathan had our room ready before we were even born." The barn itself had become something of a local landmark. Other families touched by infertility or adoption challenges would come to visit, finding comfort in the story of love that had refused to die even in the face of repeated loss. Lynette had started a support group that met monthly in the main house, offering hope to couples struggling with their own fertility journeys. Mrs. Henderson, now confined to a wheelchair but still mentally sharp, had become the group's unofficial historian, sharing stories about Jonathan's character and the gradual evolution of the mysterious barn project. "That boy knew something the rest of us took years to learn," she would tell the support group. "Family isn't about the children you birth, it's about the children you raise. And you can start raising them in your heart long before they arrive in your arms." 3 years after Jonathan's death, Lynette received a phone call that would have made him weep with joy. Dr. Martinez, the fertility specialist who had treated them decades earlier, had read about their story in a local newspaper article. "Mrs. Brooks," he'd said, "I want you to know that your husband's case file was one I never forgot. But hearing about what he built, about the family you eventually created, it's changed how I counsel my patients. I tell them now that there are many ways to become parents, and sometimes the path you don't take leads exactly where you were meant to be." The call had prompted Lynette to reach out to other couples she and Jonathan had met during their fertility treatments. Many had gone on to have biological children, but several had struggled with secondary infertility or had simply given up trying. Her story had inspired 3 of these couples to pursue adoption, creating families they'd never imagined possible. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how Lynette remembered her marriage. For years, she'd focused on what she and Jonathan had lacked, on the empty bedrooms and quiet Christmas mornings. Now she saw their relationship for what it had truly been, a love story so powerful that it had created children in the realm of imagination and hope, sustaining that love until reality could finally catch up. Sometimes the most beautiful endings are really new beginnings. On what would have been Jonathan's 70th birthday, Lynette and the children held a celebration in the barn. They'd invited Mrs. Henderson, several neighbors, and the support group families. Carlos had learned to play Happy Birthday on the harmonica Jonathan had left him, and Maria had written a poem about grandfathers who love you before they meet you. But the most special moment came when 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, a little girl from one of the families Lynette had helped through the adoption process, made an announcement. "My mama and daddy said I could tell everyone," Emma had said shyly. "We're getting a baby brother next month. And we're going to name him Jonathan, after the man who taught everyone that waiting for your family just means you love them more when they finally come home." As Lynette looked around the barn that night, at the children playing games, at the adults sharing stories, at the walls that had witnessed 35 years of solitary hope transformed into community celebration, she finally understood what Jonathan had been trying to tell her in his final letter. Love multiplies when it's shared. The love he'd poured into that secret room hadn't been wasted or delusional, it had been practice. Practice for being the kind of people who could open their hearts to children who needed them. Practice for creating the kind of home where hope could flourish. Practice for building the kind of legacy that would inspire others to choose love over fear. The barn still contained Jonathan's original furniture, the hand-carved crib, the rocking chair, the carefully painted murals. But now it also held bunk beds and school backpacks, soccer cleats and art supplies, the beautiful mess of real children living real lives. The imaginary family had made room for the actual family, and somehow both existed in perfect harmony. Maria had asked recently if she could keep Jonathan's journal, to add her own entries about what it was like to live in a room built with 35 years of love. September 15, 2025, her first entry read, "Today I understand why Papa Jonathan built this place. It wasn't just for the children in his imagination, it was for all the children who would need to know they were wanted before they were found. This room was never empty. It was just waiting for us to fill it with the right kind of love. Sometimes karma takes time, but it never misses, and sometimes the greatest justice is simply love finally finding its way home. Sometimes karma takes time, but it never misses, and sometimes the greatest justice is simply love finally finding its way home." This story proves that the greatest mysteries aren't always hidden secrets, sometimes they're hidden love, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Jonathan Brooks spent 35 years being a father to children who existed only in his heart, but that love was so real, so powerful, that it eventually drew the children who needed him most right to his door. Love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a locked barn and 35 years of questions. But when it's finally revealed, it has the power to transform not just our understanding of the past, but our hope for the future. Subscribe for more incredible stories that remind us that love always finds a way.